Hello, Edward here from 088. In this session, we're going to be talking about Move On Dark. Now, Move On Dark is a feature of all consoles running the Xeros software. And what it does is it basically, in a queue stack, if you're playing back a queue stack, if you go into a queue and your LEDs, your moving lights go to 0%, they're turned off in the queue, the console's going to go, well, I'm not using that light anymore. Can I prepare it for when it's next used? And the console will prepare it, and we'll see what we mean by preparing it in a bit. The console will prepare it so that when that light is next used, you just simply see the intensity raise over the top. Let's dive in and take a little bit of a deeper look. So on my screen, I'm running Phantom Xeros. Now, Phantom Xeros, that's software that allows you to emulate any console running the Xeros software. So for this, I am emulating a Flex console. So there's a little virtual front panel of my Flex. The left-hand side of my screen, that is emulating what my external monitor would display. So if I had an external monitor connected to my Flex, this is what it would display, just so that we can see the various windows and the various settings as we go through this session. But as I mentioned, not just Flex, this is available on all consoles running Xeros software. Top right of my window, as you can see, I've got capture visualization software running. So that's going to help us as we go through today and using our virtual console. It's going to show us what's happening on our virtual stage. And as you can see, I've got Phantom Xeros here and Capture talking to each other. Go and check out our other sessions if you're interested in connecting Capture to your console. So to kick things off then, let's just do a very simple example to see Move On Dark in action. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take down my playback that I had running there, and I'm going to close my virtual front panel and open my internal touchscreen. This emulates what you would see on your internal touchscreen. I'm going to go to my groups. I'm going to turn my wash fixtures onto full. I did that by double clicking a group. If you double click a group, it will turn those fixtures onto full. Now I've done that, I'm going to just record that as my first cue. So I'm going to go and tap my record button on the console. And for the purpose of this, I'm going to store this onto my master playback. Now, worth mentioning, you can program a cue stack onto any playback in the console. You don't just have to program cue stacks onto the master playback. But that's what we'll do for this. So I've tapped record. I'm now going to go ahead and tap my master playbacks button. And there we go. We can now see in my cue list window on my external monitor, I can see my first cue. If you don't have an external monitor connected, you can still view the cues window in your internal touchscreen. Tap view and you will see it. So in my cue list window here, I've now got a yellow row. That is indicating that my first cue has been recorded. It's yellow, meaning it's ready to play. It's not on stage at the moment. Currently, I've still got my manual values on stage at the moment. So you can see that I turn the lights on, I've recorded as a cue. At the moment, I've still got those manual values on. I'm not playing my cue back yet. I'm now going to go and record my second cue. And my second cue is just going to be a blackout. Simple as that. So I'm going to go and double tap my clear button. That is a very quick way of turning any manual values off. Clearing out my manual values. And I'm now going to go and tap my record button again. And I'm going to go and tap my master playback button again. And that's recorded my blackout. So you can see here, I've got my first cues recorded and my second cues recorded. And you'll notice I've now got a couple of fields in here. I've got some fade times. So the console saying, well, there's intensity information stored in the cue. we saw that because I obviously turned the lights on in the first cue. So I now have some intensity fade times that I can use if I wish. I'm now going to go and turn those lights back on. So I'm going to double tap my group again. And I'm going to put them in a colour. Let's go for a blue. And I'm going to put them in a position. And I'm actually going to put them in one of my pre-recorded position palettes that I've already made for myself. So now I've got them in my intensity, my colour and my position I'm happy with. I'm going to go and tap record. Tap my master playbacks button again. And we've stored that now into Q3. You'll now notice we have fades for colour and position, because now Q3, as well as having intensity, because I've just turned those lights back on, we've also got colour and position information in that cue as well. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to double tap clear again. I'm going to go and tap record and tap my master playbacks button one last time to record a blackout as my very last cue. Great stuff. I'm now going to go and close my internal touchscreen. I'm going to open my virtual front panel. And let's play those cues back. So I'm going to go and push up my master playback fader. My lights come on. Notice the intensity percentage is now in blue. That means blue is coming from a cue. Remember, the red values were the manual control values that I used. I'm now going to go and press my go button. And we can see in my cue list window, my green row, that's the cue I'm in. The yellow row, that's the cue I'm going to go to when I press my go button. And so when I press my go button, my intensities are going to fall and I go into my blackout. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will now notice that in my output window, I now have a grey box with a black 0 for each of those fixtures that I was using. And that is the indication that move on dark has happened. Because I've gone into Q2, which has turned my lights off, and the console's gone, well, I'm not using lights 1 through to 10 anymore. Are they used further down the Q stack? And the answer is yes, they're actually used by Q3. They were used by Q3, and Q3's got them in a colour, and it's got them in a position. So it's actually prepared those lights ready for that cue. And that means that when I press my go button, even though I've got colour data and I've got position data that I would in theory transfer to when I press go, they're already in the colour and the position information. So I just see intensity fading over the top. I don't get beams swinging around. I don't get odd colour changes happening on stage. I just get a nice, neat intensity fade up. Press my go button and we go to black. We go back to our blackout. And so that's move on dark. We've just seen it happening there. All of the action for this particular cue stack is happening in Q2, because Q2 is the one that takes those fixtures to 0. The console realises, right, I'm ready to, I use these fixtures later on, and so it prepares them for me. Let's take a look at that again, but this time let's use the benefit of Capture's window here. So if I go to my groups and select those fixtures, notice that you get a little halo in Capture. Again, if you want to know about how we can configure Capture with the console, do check out our other sessions. But we can see here there's a little halo around those fixtures in Capture because I've selected them in my console. I'm going to press my go button. My fixtures fade off, but watch the Capture window here because you can see those fixtures have moved. That's the move on dark actually happening there. And I can now see, yep, there's my grey outline again. And in my parameter table, and that's what this window is here at the bottom of your external, the bottom of your output window on the external monitor, I can see my fixtures are in my position palette 2 and in my colour palette 10. remember, I recorded those into Q3. We're in Q2, and yet they're already set on my light, and that's because the console is reading ahead for me. Notice, if I were to go and turn my lights on right now, and I'm going to go and turn them on manually, if I were to do that, remember you can double click a group to do that if you want to. If I turn them on, you can see there, they are already on in their colour and position of Q3 that's coming up. Notice in this case here, the console is telling me that. It's telling, right, well, you've turned them on manually. Well, that's what the red intensity percentage is. You've turned them on manually, but just so you're aware, they are in their prepped state. They are in their prepared state for a cue that's coming up. That's what my grey background is still telling me. I'm going to double tap clear. That takes me back to my blackout. And as we've said already, I can press my go button to go into the cue. And I just see intensity raise over the top. Now, we have various move on dark settings available to us. Now, first things first, at the bottom of your cue list window in the external monitor, this will show you your move on dark status. You can see that there. And it's currently saying there is a delay of 1 second and a fade of 3. Those are the defaults. But what do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is if I run through these cues again, I'm going to select these fixtures again because that will help us in our capture visualizer. It will help us see what's happening. I'm actually going to zoom in on those as well just to make it a bit easier for us. Press my go button. The lights fade to black. That's using my downtime here. That's got a default of 3 seconds. I could change that if I wanted to. So I'm going to press my go button and that fade is going to run through. You can see the fade running through. When that completes, there will be a delay of 1 second and then my fixtures begin to move and they will then move over that fade time of 3. But we can customize that. So I'm going to take my master playback down. I'm then going to just zoom out in capture. And let's go into the playback settings where we've got some various move on dark options. To open the playback settings, press and hold your setup button on the console and tap the master playbacks button. That will open your master playback settings. And in here, the first buttons along the top here, these are kind of different tabs, different areas of control. And as you can see, there is a whole section dedicated for Move on Dark, available for every cue stack you program. And the first option is Move on Dark, enable or disable. If you wish, I could turn Move on Dark off. We'll do that in a minute to see what would happen. But, as you can see, the default for Move on Dark is it will be enabled and the console will just do the work for you automatically. I'm going to disable Move on Dark. This time, let's take a look at our cue stack and what would happen if you didn't have Move on Dark, or equally, if you were using a console that didn't have Move on Dark functionality. And what we would see is I would go into Q2, and, well, because Q2, the only thing it told those lights to do is go to 0%, that's the only thing that happens. Because the cue only told that fixture to go to 0%, we can see that because we've got no fade times for any of the other attributes. And so when I press my go button, that is when I would then see the movement, the colour change, and the intensity raise. And you can see there, it makes quite a big difference to what we actually see on stage by having our Move on Dark enabled. And as I said, it will be enabled by default. So I'm going to jump back into the settings, head to Move on Dark, and I'm going to enable that again. And on the right hand side of the screen, that's our fade times. That's our fade times, which were also indicated at the bottom. Notice that this updated to say disabled as well. If I just go and click OK, we're back enabled again, and it tells me my timings. So there's my delay and my fade. So what happens is if my lights go to dark, go to 0% intensity, they fade to black. The delay time then counts down, and then they take however long you've set for the fade time to transition from whatever they're doing at the moment to get to the values of the cue that's coming up. Now, it's worth mentioning at this point, the fixtures will prepare by default at as early opportunity as possible. So if you imagine that my lights went to black in Q2 as they do now, but then they weren't used again until Q20, for example. Well, even though the console would go into Q2 and the console would say, right, well, I'm not using these fixtures, but the next time I'm used, well, it might be Q20. And so in that case, it would then prep them in this queue ready for Q20 so that they're all ready to go and you don't need to worry about them. So it will prep your fixtures at the earliest opportunity. So I can customize these times. Now, the reason these are the defaults is they kind of work and get you a bit of a get out of jail free, as it were, if you're using old, maybe slightly noisy moving lights. Because it means that if there's a delay of 1 and a time of 3, it keeps their motors fairly quiet. You know, if you've got moving lights and they've got a big motion they've got to make, giving them a little bit longer to do it will actually keep them quieter. But if you're using some pretty modern, pretty small moving lights, actually, well, you could probably put these to 0 seconds if you wanted to. And that would mean that as soon as that light hit 0%, bang, they would snap to get ready for when they're next used. If you've got a show with some quite quick turnarounds in your queues, you're running through your queues quite quickly, you may need to do that anyway. You may need to decide that move on dark actually needs to be quicker. So I might want to this time actually say, well, I'm going to get rid of my delay and I'm going to set my fade time to be 1. Notice you can use your first encoder wheel to set the timing as well when you're in this window. So I'm going to click OK on that and OK on that. This time, I'm going to run back the queues. I'm going to go into my Q2. As soon as my fixture goes to 0, because there's no delay, straight away they start to move. And this time they only took a second. And so we saw that run through there. Let's jump back into the move on dark settings and take a look at some other options. Another switch in here is move to first queue, enable or disable. Now what that means is when you go into a queue, when you go into a blackout queue, and that is the last queue that used a particular light, if you go and enable this, it allows the console to essentially look back to the start of the queue stack. So it allows move on dark to wrap round, and it can then go, okay, well, I'm not using it in any of the rest of the queues in the queue stack, but I can actually prep it instead for the first time it's used in the queue stack, and it can wrap round. So that's what that option there does. I'm going to disable that, which is the default. And what we can then look at is some don't move options here. So we can actually say, okay, well, maybe I never want my position to be prepped, for example. I can go and click any attribute that I don't want this particular playback to prepare for me. Notice how there's a red stripe, which means enabled, by default on effect. That means that if a light goes to 0%, and it's used it's used in 10 queues time, and the next time it's using is in a circle, well, you don't really want your lights whirring around in a circle effect for the duration of the 10 queues when that light isn't used. So by default, move on dark is disabled for effect. Okay, which means that when you get to a queue where an effect is running, the effect will just fade in with the queue fade times, rather than the effect already being running and you simply raising intensity over the top. In some cases, it is useful to have your effect being moved on dark. And so you could go and turn that off if you wanted to. For the purpose of this, let's do a example. So I'm going to go and say, what shall I say? I'm going to say I don't want colour to be prepped this time. Click OK. Run through my queues. I'm going to go into Q2. Notice how my fixtures move. I get my move on dark information still, but the colour has not changed this time. And so when I press my go button this time, I see the colour fade from the colour they were in previously to the colour that I programmed. And now I'm actually seeing this timing take effect. So now that colour fade actually adhered to this value here, rather than the move on dark timings. I'm going to jump back into my move on dark settings for the playback, and I'm actually going to go and disable that to allow my move on dark to prep all attributes. So you'll see there I can be quite specific, because I can say colour, beam, shape or position. So colour, anything that changes the colour of the fixture, anything that moves it, any shape information, so your gobos and things like that, any beam, so lenses and things like that. So the nice thing about splitting beam and shape is it means that you could have your gobos all ready and prepared, but you could actually say don't move beam. And that would mean that if you went into a queue, you could get, for example, a zoom fading in, or a zoom opening out with the fade time increasing. So you can get a little bit creative with how you use these. Now, as well as having don't move options for a whole playback, you've actually got don't move options on a per queue basis as well. So for every queue you program, you have queue settings. And so what I can do is I can go into the settings of my Q2, for example, and I can add some settings to it. Click your little add button there. And in this window, that opens my queue settings window. Every queue you program will have these settings available to it. Various options in here. You can make the queue an auto queue, so it follows on from the previous queue. You can actually add macros so that this queue triggers other things to happen. Lots of options that we won't go into today, but what we will look at, of course, is our don't move options here. So exactly like we saw for our whole playback, we've got the option to say, well, for this particular queue, I don't want you to prep my position. So if I say that and click OK, I now get DMP, don't move position, is displayed for that queue settings. This time, let's play it back. I'm going to go into Q2, and the console's saying, okay, well, I can prep the colour of that light, but I'm being told don't prep position. So this time I'm going to press my go button. It will be already in its colour, but I will see a live position move run through. And so if there are certain queues where you do want to see live position fades, and as I said, there are applications where you do want that, well, you can still have move on dark enabled to get the benefits of that for most of your queues, but you can just have the odd queue saying, actually, for this particular queue, I don't want you to prep position. So you might do that for the reason of, well, you actually do want to see a live move. But you might actually want to do it for practical reasons as well. So if you've got a really quiet queue, so I don't know, there's a very quiet solo from a performer on stage, you don't really want your movers whirring around getting ready for when they're next used. So you could actually say, well, for this particular queue, I don't actually want you to prep anything. So for a particular queue, I could actually go and say, don't move anything. And I get don't move colour, beam, shape, position, effect displayed. And that would just mean the console will go into that queue, it will go, move on dark, I'm not going to prep anything yet. If you then go into the next queue that also doesn't use a light, it can then prep. So it will then prep at the next available opportunity that it can. Now remember, it's move on dark, it's on a per fixture basis. It doesn't have to be a complete blackout for move on dark to work. So it's on a per fixture basis. That's worth mentioning. If a fixture goes black, goes to dark, goes to 0% intensity, or its shutter is closed, it will then look ahead to see when it's next used. So it's on a per fixture basis. Great stuff. Now let's take a look at some other options we have available to us when it comes to move on dark and how we can use move on dark effectively. I'm going to go and turn these off. I like to have them back to defaults. Now there's a really useful tool to be aware of, and it's kind of your friend when it comes to move on dark. And if you tap your record button, that will open your record options window. If you don't have an external monitor connected, press and hold record, and that will open the record options on the internal touchscreen too. And there's a button in here called Smart Tag. Now, I'm not going to go into detail in that. Go and check out our record options session if you are interested in that. But that will be enabled by default. And one of the things that Smart Tag does is if a fixture is at 0%, it will not record colour, beam, shape, position, or effect information for that fixture, sorry. So if you have a fixture at 0 and Smart Tag is enabled, you then record or update a cue. The console will the only thing it will record is the fact that that fixture's at 0, and it won't record colour, beam, shape or position or effect information. And that is really useful because it means that move on dark can do its thing. Let me explain what I mean. Let's go into the last cue of my playback, and this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to let me come up with a good example of this. Let me home these lights, and I'm actually going to go and say let's have these in a red today in my home position. I'm then going to go and record that cue, and this time I'm going to turn these fixtures off. So I'm going to go at dot. That's a syntax shortcut to turn those fixtures to 0. This time I'm going to go and say record, but I'm going to turn Smart Tag off to show you what happens. So I've turned Smart Tag off, and I'm going to record that cue. Now at the point of recording that cue, I had colour information present, I had beam information present, and I had position information present. And so you can see those fade times are added in. I'm now going to go and turn those fixtures back on. I'm going to have them in a different colour. I'm going to have them in a different position. Something like that. And I'm going to record that. And now let's play these back. So I'm going to go into Q5, which was my cue here. I'm going to now press my go button. Those fixtures are going to go to 0% intensity. And now I'm going to press my go button. And those fixtures have prepared for me. So they have now moved on dark for me. Now, what I can also do is if I go in, I might go and accidentally change a colour of my fixture. I might accidentally change the position of my fixture in dark. And I might include this data into the cue. And so I might update it into the cue. Let's run that back. Go into the cue. Press my go button. And this time, they have gone to those hard values. And there is no move on dark that's happened. And so now if I go into my next queue, I see the live move and the live colour change. And that's because Q6 is now a blackout, but it includes hard values for colour, beam, shape and position. And therefore the console cannot prep that fixture. So if I want to get rid of those hard values, I can use my Smart Tag tool again. Go into the queue you need to get rid of the colour, beam, shape and position values of, tap update, ensure Smart Tag is back on, and tap your master playback button. And notice that removed the timings for that particular queue. I can then press my go button and the fixtures have prepped. So if you do get into the situation where you've ended up recording hard values into a blackout, that's going to mean the console goes, well, I'm in blackout, but these fixtures have been told to go here. Therefore, I can't prep them for when they're next used. If you want to clear out the colour, beam, shape and position values so that Move on Dark can prep your fixture, you can just simply do nothing else but go into the queue and update with Smart Tag enabled. So that is why Smart Tag is really useful. When you're recording or when you're updating, it's going to ignore fixtures, the colour, beam and shape and position and effect of fixtures if they're at 0%. Let's take a look at something else we can do when it comes to Move on Dark. And it's kind of related to Smart Tag, really. It's related to how that Smart Tag functionality works. So this time I'm going to select those fixtures. I'm going to go to Effects. And I'm going to go and apply a circle effect on those lights. Should we go for a circle effect? Or should we go for... Let's go for a horizontal line. It's a bit easier to see. We're not getting blinded. Now I'm going to go and press record. And record that as my next cue. Happy days. I'm now going to turn those lights off. And I'm going to record that as my next cue. And let's play that back. So there's my cue that has those lights running with their effect. I'm going to press my go button to go into dark. And notice what's happening. Those fixtures are still moving. And that's because, well, we haven't told them to stop moving yet. Okay, so if you go into a queue, if you go into a blackout and your fixtures are still moving about, well, it's probably because you haven't told them to stop. And so to stop those fixtures from moving, I can then use a really useful shortcut, which is Effect Home. If you hold Effect and tap Home, that will stop any effects running on the fixture. Or alternatively, you can use the No Effect button in the effects window. The first button in the effects window will be No Effect. My effect is now not running, so I can update my queue, but remember, must make sure Smart Tag is off. Because if it's on, the console will be ignoring any effect information if a fixture's at 0. So you must make sure Smart Tag is off, because that way when I update my queue, the console is able to include that no effect instruction. And that means now, go into my queue, my effect runs as I programmed it, and I can press my go button now. The lights fade off and the effect stops. Now, of course, if you wanted to, in some applications you might want the lights to fade off with their effect still running, but then the effect to stop. Well, you could actually do that by programming two queues. You could have a queue that turns the lights off, and then a queue that then stops them once they've faded out. And if you wanted to start to get a little bit clever, that next queue that stopped them after they faded out, well, that could be an auto after queue if you wanted to. You could make that an auto queue. So I hope that's useful, and I hope that's a useful clue of kind of how Smart Tag and Move on Dark can work together. Now, another thing you can do, as I've mentioned, is if you have Smart Tag off, you can record fixtures with hard values programmed, even though the light's dark. And that's useful if you want to get specific with timings. Now remember, for a whole playback, you have a fade time. And that's the fade time that Move on Dark will use. If you need to be specific for a particular blackout, well, record hard values into your blackout, and you can then give custom timings. So let's say that I need these fixtures to get to that position there, and I need them to go in a green. And I'm going to record that with Smart Tag disabled into my next queue. I can then give hard custom timings for that particular queue, and I can then simply raise the intensity over the top for the next queue. And that means that actually Move on Dark won't be working, because in this case here, what's happening is my fixtures go to black. My next queue then actually manually preps them. That's a manual prep. You see, there's no Move on Dark information. I've actually forced those fixtures to go to that location. I can then set custom timings, and I can then have my queue that simply raises the intensity. So in some applications, you'll need to be more specific. And actually you can say, okay, well, rather than using Move on Dark to do the work, I can manually create a queue that preps those lights in the dark, and I can then have my queue that raises the intensity only over the top. And you'll notice that this queue has no colour, beam, shape or position information in it. It's purely the intensity being raised over the top. Great stuff. Now, kind of the last thing I want to mention is if we record a single queue onto a playback, a single queue on a playback, that's not really much of a queue stack. And unfortunately, if you record a single queue onto a playback, so I'm going to go and view a playback here. If you record a single queue onto a playback, and then raise the fader, well, the console obviously hasn't been able to prep that lighting state for you. You've gone in and pushed the playback fader up, the console had no opportunity to prep those lights, and so you do see the live move and the live colour change in some scenarios as well. To avoid that happening, we can manually prepare those fixtures. And it's a little bit like what we just did here, where we manually recorded a queue to change those fixtures. What we can do is jump into the playback settings. So hold setup and tap the playbacks button. And you can change your button function. And instead you can change your button function to be a go function. And click OK. And the go button, the button of that playback now becomes a go, which means you can prep that lighting state. It goes green, meaning it's live, and you can then raise the intensity over the top. And that's how you can then manually prep those lights. So in a queue stack scenario, Move on Dark will do the work for you and prep your lights automatically. If you've got a single lighting state on a fader, you can use that as a way of manually preparing those lights for when they're next used. Last thing to talk about really is Move on Dark defaults. So if you press the setup key on your console, that will take you into setup. And on the left hand side, we can go and hit defaults. This is where you can go and customize all of the programming defaults on the console, and there's a button in here for playback defaults. Go in there, and then we can go to Move on Dark. And now we can go and configure our Move on Dark options for any future queues that we program on our console. So maybe you're always wanting for your queues to be a 0-second delay and a 1-second fade, for example. Well, go and customize your defaults, click OK, and now any future queues that you program, any future playbacks that you program, will use those custom timings. So I hope you found that useful as we've kind of dived and explored all of the various Move on Dark options and settings available to us. And we've also taken a look a little bit about how Smart Tag can be used as a tool to help Move on Dark, but can also be used as a tool to allow you to manually record values rather than letting Move on Dark do the work, if you need to. I hope you found that useful. If you've got any questions, please do drop us an email to support@088.com, and I will see you on the next training session.